There's a strange phenomenon in geopolitics. Some wars are obviously irrational, and that's exactly what makes them dangerous. Because if a conflict looks like it would bankrupt economies, destabilize regimes, and torch global trade, then the real question isn't, is it possible? The question becomes, what kind of leader would still do it? Taiwan sits at the center of the most volatile strategic triangle on Earth. China, the United States, and America's allies across the Western Pacific. It's close enough to the Chinese coast to feel inevitable in political speeches, yet far enough to rewrite world history if the wrong decision is made. People often talk about a Chinese invasion like it's a countdown timer that will eventually hit zero, but possible and likely are not the same thing. China can build ships, China can fire missiles, China can intimidate and blockade, but launching a full-scale amphibious invasion, seizing Taiwan, subduing its people, surviving the blowback, and holding it long-term is not just difficult. It may be one of the most economically self-destructive moves China could ever attempt. So instead of asking the vague question, will China invade? We're going to ask a sharper one. Can China afford to invade? And once you break the problem down, geography, military reality, politics, economics, and escalation risk, you start to see why the answer is not easily, not cleanly, and not without gambling the foundations of China's power. At the same time, it's important to be clear, this is not a case for complacency. Even if China can't afford an invasion, history is full of conflicts that began because leaders miscalculated, domestic pressure spiked, or one side believed destiny was calling. So this is a story about constraints, the invisible walls that make invasion far more costly than most people assume. To begin, we need to start with the most underrated factor in any war, the map. Because before ideology and weapons, geography sets the stage. China is a continental giant with a powerful heartland. Fertile river basins, enormous population centers, and industrial regions that can scale manufacturing like few places on Earth. Historically, the greatest dangers to Chinese states came by land, through open plains and steppe routes where invaders could move quickly. But in the modern era, that land threat is not the primary problem. Instead, China faces a maritime dilemma. Its coastline opens into a Western Pacific that is not empty, but structured by choke points and islands. This matters because China's economy is heavily dependent on the sea. For energy imports, raw materials, export shipping routes, and the container traffic that feeds Chinese factories. And this is where the first island chain becomes central. Stretching from Japan's southern islands down through Taiwan into the Philippines and towards Southeast Asia, this chain isn't a single alliance or a single treaty. It's geography combined with politics, a line where U.S. partners, U.S. bases, and U.S. access agreements cluster. The result is simple. China's Navy doesn't just sail freely into the Pacific. In a crisis, Chinese forces have to pass through monitored lanes and narrow straits, pinch points that can be contested. So Taiwan is not just emotionally symbolic. It is strategically positioned like a lock in the middle of China's maritime environment. If China controlled Taiwan, it would not only change a map, it would gain forward positioning that reshapes the naval balance of the Western Pacific. However, that temptation immediately collides with the trap. Taiwan is an island, and islands are famously hard to invade. With that geographic foundation in place, the next step is to understand why Taiwan's status makes any attack politically explosive. Taiwan is, in practice, a self-governing society. It has its own democratic elections, its own military chain of command, its own currency and financial system, its own immigration controls, and deep economic connections across the world. Diplomatically, its status is ambiguous. Many governments publicly acknowledge one China in some form, but also maintain robust economic and security ties with Taiwan. That ambiguity exists because it reduces the chance of immediate crisis. If Taiwan formally declares independence, Beijing could treat it as crossing a red line. But if Beijing attacks Taiwan, much of the world will treat it as what it looks like in reality, an invasion of a self-governing society. And that political reality matters because it shapes resistance. An invasion is not simply moving troops, it's a political project, forcing control over a population that largely does not want it. Taiwan's people have watched how Beijing governs, and identity has shifted over decades. This means any attempt to take Taiwan isn't just a military operation, it becomes a long-term legitimacy struggle and potentially an occupation facing resistance, sabotage, and international support. At this point, it's worth asking, if the costs are so high, why does Taiwan remain such a central issue for Beijing? The answer is that Taiwan is not just territory to the Chinese Communist Party. It is a psychological and historical symbol. Modern Chinese political messaging is heavily shaped by the story of humiliation and recovery, unequal treaties, foreign influence, national weakness, and the promise that the party restored China. Taiwan complicates that narrative because it represents unfinished business from the Civil War era, a rival system that survived, modernized, democratized, and prospered. When legitimacy is tied to destiny, symbols become dangerous. That's why Taiwan remains central to political messaging, military planning, and nationalist education. But desire does not override reality, and the most brutal reality begins with the hardest operation a military can attempt: an amphibious invasion. Amphibious invasions sit in a category of risk that is different from almost every other kind of warfare. To invade Taiwan, China would need to assemble and prepare a massive force, suppress air defenses and radar, contest air superiority over the Strait, protect transport vessels from missiles and submarines, land troops under fire, secure ports and airports intact, keep supplies moving across water, defeat counterattacks, take and hold dense urban areas, and then stabilize the island politically. And crucially, it has to do this while the world watches in real time. That's because an amphibious invasion is not just a battle, it's a supply chain across water. If the supply chain breaks, the invasion force becomes stranded. So Taiwan's defense planning increasingly focuses on denial. Not necessarily defeating China everywhere, but preventing China from landing, reinforcing, and sustaining. This is the logic behind what is often described as a porcupine approach, making the island too painful to swallow. The idea is to rely on systems that impose heavy costs on ships and landing forces, anti-ship missiles, mines, mobile air defenses, drones for targeting and attrition, hardened infrastructure, dispersed command systems, and civil defense readiness. Taiwan's physical geography strengthens this defensive logic. There are limited beaches suitable for large landings, dense cities that become brutal to clear, and choke points that defenders can turn into kill zones. So even if China achieves local successes, the larger problem remains. China must not only win, it must win fast, before international responses lock in and before the costs spiral. And that leads directly to a lesson the world has learned recently. Wars are cheaper to start than to finish. Ukraine is not Taiwan, but Ukraine revealed a pattern that applies broadly. Large powers often begin wars expecting speed and decisiveness, and then get trapped in logistics, attrition, and long-term political and economic damage. Ukraine also demonstrated that defenders with outside support can keep fighting, and that sanctions can be deployed at scale. Now here's the key difference. China is far more embedded in global trade networks than Russia ever was. That means economic punishment would not be a side effect. It would be a central battlefield. Sanctions, export controls, and financial restrictions would create a shock that spreads globally. But even if the world suffers, China would likely suffer first and most. This brings us to the decision-making environment in Beijing, because whether China invades is not just a question of capability. It's also a question of timing, demographics, and political risk. China is aging quickly. Aging societies tend to prioritize stability. Aging also increases fiscal burdens, pensions, healthcare, and slower economic growth. War is easier to sell in a young, rising society that believes tomorrow will be richer than today. It becomes harder when a society is cautious and invested in economic security. Then there is the leadership factor. Centralized personal rule can raise strategic risk because dissent is punished, bad news is filtered, and ideology can crowd out analysis. But personal rule also raises the cost of failure. A botched Taiwan war would not just damage China internationally, it would challenge domestic legitimacy. For Beijing, that makes the margin for error intolerably small. And now we arrive at the core constraint, economics. Even if China could attempt invasion militarily, it may not be able to afford what happens next. A Taiwan conflict would not stay local. It would function like an earthquake inside global supply chains. The waters around Taiwan sit along one of the busiest commercial corridors on the planet. War would mean sky-high insurance costs, rerouted shipping, port disruption, panic stockpiling, delayed deliveries, and price spikes. Even rumors and partial blockades could cause huge economic shocks. Then comes the financial response. If the United States and its partners chose to use sanctions on major Chinese banks, expand export controls, and restrict access to high-end technology, the consequences would cascade through finance, trade credit, and investor confidence. Supply chains would fracture, foreign investment could retreat, currency pressure could rise, and unemployment could spike in export-heavy regions. Sanctioning China is harder than sanctioning a smaller economy because the world depends on Chinese manufacturing, but harder does not mean impossible. It means messier, yet potentially still catastrophic. And the most critical economic vulnerability in a Taiwan war is semiconductors. Taiwan sits at the core of advanced chip production. Modern economies run on chips: phones, servers, cars, medical devices, power infrastructure, and military systems. Even partial disruption could trigger shortages worse than the pandemic-era crunch. Here's the paradox. Taiwan is valuable partly because it works. War is the fastest way to make it stop working. Advanced chip fabrication depends on stable electricity, precision logistics, specialized chemicals, and highly controlled environments. War breaks that, and sabotage becomes likely. Even a victory could hand China destroyed infrastructure and a workforce unwilling to cooperate, all while facing global restrictions and the long-term collapse of trust. So China doesn't just risk sanctions, it risks breaking the very industrial ecosystem it wants to gain. Next, we need to add another structural vulnerability: energy. China imports huge amounts of oil and gas, much of it by sea, passing through choke points like Malacca and other narrow corridors. In a major conflict, rival navies wouldn't necessarily need to win an immediate, decisive battle near Taiwan to hurt China. They could threaten the arteries feeding China's economy. Full blockade is legally and politically complicated. But in wartime, interdiction becomes thinkable. And even the risk of interdiction raises costs dramatically. This means a Taiwan war becomes a race against time. The longer it runs, the more China faces economic suffocation. This is one reason speed matters so much to Beijing's planning. But speed creates escalation incentives. To end the war quickly, China might have to strike harder, wider, and more violently, inviting retaliation, regional involvement, and potentially crossing thresholds that escalate beyond control. Which is why we have to talk about the regional picture, because Taiwan is not isolated. A conflict there drags in surrounding states due to geography and alliances. Japan is near Taiwan, hosts major U.S. forces, and depends on maritime trade routes that pass close to the Strait. If Taiwan falls under Beijing's control, Japan's strategic environment changes overnight. China's reach expands, Japan's sea lanes become more vulnerable, and pressure increases on disputed territories. That's why Japan has been steadily strengthening deterrence. South Korea often tries to balance economic ties with China against its security relationship with the US. But major war ends balancing. Trade routes and supply chains would be threatened, and US forces on the peninsula could become targets if China tried to keep America out of the fight. Meanwhile, the Philippines sits on key approaches to Taiwan and the South China Sea. Its territory is strategically positioned for basing, surveillance, logistics, and maritime control. It also has its own disputes with Beijing. In a Taiwan war, the Philippines becomes a tripwire and a staging zone, whether it wants to or not. So the conflict picture is not China versus Taiwan. It is China versus Taiwan, plus a network of states whose security calculations depend on the outcome, plus the world's economic response. And then, there's the shadow that hangs over every great power conflict: escalation. Would a Taiwan war go nuclear? No one can answer that with certainty. But we can outline what increases the risk: fear of regime collapse, fear of total military defeat, strikes on the homeland, threats to leadership survival, and collapsing command and control. Even without nuclear weapons, conventional escalation could be catastrophic. Cyber attacks on infrastructure, disruption of satellites and communications, attacks on ports and airfields, and economic warfare against third countries. The more intense the war, the harder it becomes to stop. And because the stakes are existential for the actors involved, the pressure to escalate in moments of perceived weakness increases. So, if invasion is this costly and unpredictable, why does the world still worry? Because wars don't always come from rational affordability calculations. They often come from crisis dynamics, accidents, domestic politics, misperception, and miscalculation. One pathway is accidental escalation: a collision at sea, an aircraft downed, a missile landing wrongly, a commander trying to signal strength. In high-tension environments, incidents become symbols, and symbols become political pressure. Another pathway is domestic insecurity. Leaders who fear losing legitimacy sometimes externalize conflict to unify the public. This can happen anywhere. But authoritarian systems carry a specific risk. Propaganda can replace reality, and internal debate can be suppressed. This increases the odds of strategic misjudgment. A third pathway is misreading the US response. China may gamble that America won't fight. America may gamble that China won't act. Both could assume the other side will blink. That is how flashpoints become wars. A fourth pathway is gradual escalation into blockade or coercion. China may prefer pressure that stops short of invasion: customs inspections, maritime harassment, partial blockades, or quarantine-style measures. But those in-between actions can trigger military responses and spiral anyway. So the danger isn't only a dramatic beach landing. The danger is the road toward confrontation, the steps that normalize conflict and reduce room for de-escalation. Now we can land the conclusion clearly. China wants Taiwan. China prepares for Taiwan. China signals Taiwan. But wanting something is not the same as being able to afford it. A Taiwan invasion risks shattering China's trade model, triggering severe sanctions and capital flight, disrupting global shipping, collapsing fragile high-tech ecosystems, pulling regional actors into the fight, and escalating into a broader catastrophe. Above all, it risks something Beijing fears more than foreign pressure: domestic instability and loss of legitimacy if the war drags or fails. That is the heart of the constraint. China's greatest strength, its integration into the world economy, is also the shackle that makes a Taiwan war so costly. So the most realistic near-term future may not be invasion. It may be a long period of coercion, gray zone pressure, and constant risk. An unstable standoff where nobody wants war, but everyone prepares for it. And that is why Taiwan matters. Not because war is guaranteed, but because in a world of fragile deterrence, one mistake can become history. If you want more deep dives like this, Geopolitics Explained Without Panic and Without Propaganda, subscribe and share your view. Do you think the future is invasion, blockade, or a long cold standoff? Because Taiwan is not just a map dispute. It's a stress test for the global order, and the outcome will shape the next century.